everyone, and welcome to this session of the Karl Jasper Society of North America. We're having Author Meets Critics, Gadamer's Hermeneutics by Robert Dostal of Bryn Mawr College. So we're going to begin with Mirela Oliva of the University of St. Thomas, who will start us off with her comments on Gadamer's Hermeneutics.
Robert Dostal's book examines, among other topics, how Gadamer adopts and modifies Aristotle's paradigm of the good life. For Aristotle, the good life has both a practical and a theoretical dimension. The good life means to develop moral excellence and contemplate truth. The latter dimension has, however, priority for Aristotle. Contemplation is truly the summit of a good life. Now, unlike Aristotle, Gadamer balances the practical and theoretical life and emphasizes the practical. Dostal starts his book with Gadamer's critique of the Enlightenment and subsequent endorsement of civic humanism. The main charge against Enlightenment regards the subjectivism that afflicts both the theoretical and ethical domains. In the theoretical domain, subjectivism affects the representational epistemology focused on mental representations rather than things themselves. So this is Dostal's individuation of the problem in Gadamer's critique. Continuing the phenomenological tradition, Gadamer pays attention to modes of presentation of things and moves away from representationalism. And here, Dostal rightly points to a frequent mistake in translating Gadamer's term Darstellung with representation, which misses Gadamer's clear-cut rejection of representationalism. Darstellung means actually presentation. Gadamer has for representation a different word, namely Vorstellung. And it's not Gadamer, it's really German. So the difference between presentation and representation is very important. Because it was stuck in representationalism, the Enlightenment neglected various modes of presentation of things visible in language and tradition. In modern philosophy, language is just an instrumental sign used to express representations. Furthermore, tradition is dubbed an obstacle to knowledge. One should acquire knowledge independently from a pre-existing set of ideas, beliefs, and practices simply by using the appropriate method. In the practical domain, Gadamer accuses the Enlightenment of abandoning the Greek phronesis, prudence, in favor of a scientific kind of ethics that must follow precise rules. While virtue ethics promoted prudential judgment in concrete circumstances, modern ethics reduced human affairs to a rigorous algorithm following a normative setting that reason gives to itself. Gadamer's main weapon against modern subjectivism is phronesis. So here is where Gadamer's model starts to build up. Dostal thinks that with phronesis, Gadamer does counteract not only legalist ethical reductionism, but also theoretical representationalism. Phronesis grounds Gadamer's civic humanism that embraces both domains, theoretical and practical. Unlike the subjective humanism rejected by Heidegger, Gadamer's humanism facilitates the presentation of things through our practical involvement in an active tradition that educates us. This, I believe, remains an essential piece of Gadamer's legacy in contemporary philosophy. Other reactions to modern subjectivism focus, for instance, on Aristotelian metaphysics. I am also a Thomist, so I am familiar with the Thomistic scholarship. And in Thomism, this is usually the standard reaction to look into Aristotle's metaphysics. However, Gadamer shows that this revival of Aristotle can only occur in a broader framework, including our concrete embedding in a specific historical context. So that's something that Thomists very often miss. His notion of Bildung, education, common sense, judgment, and taste point to a personal formation steeped in the treasures of culture. In a humanist key, understanding is phronetic because it does not merely turn unto an object, but rather is triggered by an object, the same way in which moral action is called upon by particular circumstances. Thus, Dostal writes, I quote, "And inasmuch as the task of understanding a text is fundamentally the same task of understanding in general, that is, of experience and understanding our world, there is an important sense in which Gadamer's hermeneutics requires us to let the world make a claim on us. This claim both binds us and frees us. The truth shall set you free. An appropriate hermeneutics, accordingly, requires the transformation of the self. It is in this sense that Gadamer consistently refers to hermeneutics as practical philosophy. In this understanding, which is a subordination or submission, there is no sharp distinction between the normative and the cognitive." End of quotation. Dostal also retrieves this concrete kind of engagement in Gadamer's conception of language and linguisticality. Therefore, he notes that Gadamer is not interested in the syntax and semantics of language, but rather in the speech acts, namely in what happens when we talk to others and to ourselves. So this view of language, according to Dostal, flows naturally from this fundamental practical disposition given by phronesis, by the phonetic model of understanding. These speech acts rest on the background of our common world and the concern for the truth of the matter at hand. Gadamer's notion of language of things expresses this relationship between the speaking subject and things themselves. In language, we do not nominate things according to representations we have about them. Instead, things speak to us. However, Dostal states that Gadamer does not fully clarify this notion, and we need, Dostal suggests, to look farther to another notion, namely the inner world. This is another Gadamerian notion that is borrowed from the medieval tradition of Verbum Interius. The inner world is the language of reason prior to utterance. It is the act of knowledge itself, simultaneous with the formation of the intellect. Thus, it does not express the mind, but the thing intended. For Dostal, this inner word, prior to the vocal utterance, indicates a non-linguistic linguisticality that avoids linguistic idealism and does justice to the elusive language of things. Furthermore, it makes room for intuition, a feature that Gadamer does not sufficiently consider. Finally, theoretical life requires some virtues shared with practical life. Openness, humility, and charity exercised in conversation with others. The willingness to allow that the conversation partner might be right and we are wrong sustains the ethos of a conversation, without which, for Gadamer, there can be no theoretical life. At the same time, understanding also entails self-understanding, because the other also gives us the opportunity of second-person knowledge. For instance, Dostal writes, one sees oneself in the other. It is a friend who will be honest with us and help us overcome our self-deceptions. In conclusion, the good life is both theoretical and practical. Theory is phronetic because it arises from our practical involvement in the world and has dynamics determined by concrete experiences, historicity, common sense, and so on. On the other hand, the practical rests on a worldview emerging from understanding. But what exactly unifies these two dimensions? It seems to me that Dostal's analysis remains transcendental and does not leap into an ontological foundation. Dostal briefly observes at the end of the book that Plato's idea of good can stand as a unifier, even though Gadamer mainly focuses on truth. I quote, "Yet Gadamer would remind us that the divided line and the cave story in Plato's Republic, which present us with an image and a story about our grasp of ideas and reality, at the same time point to the good as that which makes this grasp possible." This closing remark, I think, encourages a further reflection on what grounds both the practical and the theoretical, and how theoretical and practical notions sustain each other. This task would go well beyond Dostal's approach in this book. It would help emphasize how the unifying gesture of Gadamer's phonetic hermeneutics could bring an element of novelty in today's strict partition of philosophical branches. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Oliva for her remarks on my book and for the suggestion that it would be good for us to reflect on how the theoretical and practical sustain each other. And she's right to say that such a reflection would go beyond what I've done in this book. She's also correct in saying that in my book, I show how Gadamer follows Aristotle in many important regards. I'd like to take up briefly two important claims that Professor Oliva makes in these remarks. The one concerns her claim about the difference between Aristotle and Gadamer. The other concerns her claim that my analysis remains transcendental and does not, citing her leap into an ontological foundation. So, first, the difference between Aristotle and Gadamer. Oliva says, and I quote, "Unlike Aristotle, Gadamer balances the practical and theoretical life and emphasizes the practical." It's true that Gadamer calls his hermeneutical philosophy practical. And it is the case that Aristotle would not refer to his philosophical project simply as practical. Yet I would argue that Gadamer means for his own work to be true to Aristotle, and that is to follow Aristotle in this very important regard. So let me cite Oliva's remarks once again. "The good life means to develop moral excellence and contemplate truth. The latter dimension has, however, priority. Contemplation is truly the summit of the good life." End of quote. Now, the two dimensions in that first sentence are moral excellence and contemplation of truth. So, two things, moral, practical, theoretical. But what does Aristotle mean by moral excellence? One way to state this simply is achieving the good life. And the good life is the life of contemplation or study. I rather like the translation of theoreticos as study as opposed to contemplation. The latter's a bit too monkish. says one who was trained by the Benedictines. Study is a little more active. But anyway, this is to say that what Oliva has called two dimensions are in the end one. Moral excellence ends up meaning the life of theory. As we all know, Aristotle begins his metaphysics with the claim that every human desires to know. Fulfilling this desire is the fulfillment of the human. Study or theorizing is the activity that provides this fulfillment. The theoretical life has its own sort of praxis. And Gadamer is happy to point this out in a number of places in his work. And it's also the case when Gadamer is commenting on people who've commented on his work with respect to the practicality or the fact that hermeneutics is practical. Gadamer points out that in writing his hermeneutics, the philosophical hermeneutics is the theory of practice. Anyway, Oliva is right to point out that Gadamer's magnum opus, Truth and Method, citing her comments, mainly focuses on truth. It's true, truth and method. But yet, if you look at the conclusion of the work, Gadamer ends up embracing the transcendentals of medieval philosophy, whereby the true and the good are one. That having been said, much of Gadamer's later work emphasizes the practical character of his hermeneutics. His identification with Aristotle in this regard is made clear, especially in his book, The Idea of the Good in Platonic Aristotelian Philosophy. In short, I'm suggesting that Gadamer finds a balance between the theoretical and practical in Aristotle, and he tries to rehabilitate that in his own work. One further comment in this regard. Oliva nicely points out that some of the virtues, the principal virtues that characterize our practical life are the same virtues that characterize the theoretical life. Openness, humility, charity among them. These are the same virtues that sustain our practical life with others and our theoretical life. Both these forms of life require, both the theoretical and the practical, require conversation. For Gadamer, the life of philosophy is a life of conversation with others and conversation with the written works of others. And it is in conversation that we find our solidarity with others and sustain the civic community and the state through political activity. So I am minimizing Gadamer's difference with Aristotle in this regard to the question of the relation of the theoretical and practical. And I am suggesting that Gadamer will help us carry out the reflection that Oliva has called for on the relation of theoretical and practical. Gadamer does so by taking us back to Aristotle, and clearly there's much more that could be said about this that I don't say, and Gadamer doesn't either. The second claim in Oliva's remarks that I wish to comment on is a remark about my book. She says, and I quote, "It seems to me that Dostal's analysis remains transcendental, does not leap into an ontological foundation." I confess I am not quite sure as to what she means by this. I do argue in the book that we should consider Gadamer's hermeneutical philosophy, his philosophical hermeneutics, as a contribution to transcendental philosophy. I won't rehearse that argument now, but I will point out, as I do in the book, that Gadamer both claims that he's rejected transcendental philosophy and that his philosophical hermeneutics are, quote, quasi-transcendental. Gadamer, like many others, seems to think that transcendental philosophy requires the transcendental ego of Husserl, or similarly, the transcendental unity of apperception of Kant, the I think that accompanies all our representations. This is too subjectivistic for Gadamer. And Gadamer is also critical of Husserl's drive for a Letztbegründung, a final foundation. And thus Gadamer rejects transcendental philosophy as subjectivistic and foundationalist. Yet, Gadamer does point out that there is a clear line from Husserl's notions of passive synthesis and anonymous intentionality to hermeneutics. To put it briefly, I'm aligning Gadamer's hermeneutics with the transcendental phenomenology of the early Heidegger. Being and Time is both a work in transcendental phenomenology and a work in fundamental ontology. Gadamer's hermeneutics does not pursue the question of being, But the last section of Truth and Method culminates in what Gadamer expressly calls hermeneutical ontology. It is the case that, as Oliva is suggesting, I do not develop a robust account of Gadamer's ontology, but I do make a case for reading Gadamer as a kind of realist. Oliva seems interested in an ontological foundation, but I would suggest that Gadamer in Truth and Method would provide an ontology without providing a foundation. Again, very like the early Heidegger. In this regard, it may be worth noting that Gadamer never, of course one should never say never, almost never writes about his ontology after the major work of Truth and Method. He doesn't strike that ontological note.
We're going to hear now from Georgia Warnke of the University of California at Riverside.
Professor Dostal's book, Gadamer's Hermeneutics, is a book so erudite that one can acquire a first-class education in the humanities just by reading the endnotes. Given that Dostal's knowledge and insight are far beyond my own, here I would like to restrict myself to his observations on Gadamer's political theory. Actually, Dostal points out that there is no developed political theory in Gadamer's opus. Still, Gadamer is interested in the ethical basis of politics, according to Dostal, and like Aristotle, looks to civic friendship as the transition between ethics and politics and the basis for solidarity. Dostal elicits two additional points from Gadamer's comments on friendship and solidarity. First, as Darren Walhoff also indicates, in the case of neither friendship nor solidarity, does Gadamer's account presume similarities between participants? Second, solidarity is not created, but discovered through conversation and dialogue. I want to look at each of Dostal's claims, not to argue against them, but to offer a few amplifications and some possible tweaks. I begin with the relation between friendship and solidarity. Gadamer's remarks here confirm Dostal's emphasis on Gadamer's critique of the subjectivism of modern thought. To be sure, Gadamer sees a difference, or what he calls a tension, between friendship and solidarity that Dostal does not investigate. Nevertheless, one of the Gadamer's important insights about both is that they have a substantive, non-subjective existence. Friendship is more than a feeling of friendliness toward or concern for a person who may or may not feel similarly towards oneself. Rather, although one may have feelings about one's friendship with someone, friendship itself is not a feeling or attitude at all. Instead, it exists intersubjectively, as a life friends live together. Likewise, solidarity is not, quote, just sentiment or disposition, unquote. One cannot have solidarity on one's own as a matter of feeling solidarity with another who may or may not feel similarly. And as with friendship, one can have feelings about one's solidarity with others, but that solidarity is not itself feeling. Rather, it is a bond with others that can constrain and override one's feelings. This non-subjectivist view of solidarity can be clarified by comparing it to the account that Keith Banting and Will Kimlicka offer in the introduction to their edited collection, The Strains of Commitment, the political sources of solidarity in diverse societies. Their concern is the degree to which the religious, cultural, and traditional diversity of modern democratic societies can undermine social solidarity and cohesiveness, and they argue that the possibility of avoiding this outcome depends upon the prevalence of, quote, a set of attitudes and motivations. Developing solidarity thus depends on political institutions and policies that can help to cultivate and reinforce the necessary attitudes, in their view. Yet, for Gadamer, solidarity is not a question of attitudes, and hence cannot be fostered by cultivating the correct ones. Nor does he buy into Banting and Kimlicka's initial premise that the threat to solidarity is the diversity of modern democratic societies, because he does not link solidarity to non-diversity in religion, culture, ethnicity, or the like in the first place. This view distinguishes Gadamer's analysis not only from Banting and Kimlicka, but as both Dostal and Walloff point out, from Richard Rorty's, who ties solidarity to particular as opposed to universal shared identities. We recognize and act in solidarity with someone not because they are human, but because they are like us. This is sorority, whether as, quote, a fellow Milanese or a fellow Jutlander, or a fellow member of the same union or profession, or a fellow bocce player, or a fellow parent of small children, unquote. In contrast, Dostal writes, Gadamer's account of solidarity begins with our situated differences with the others and how we might find that we have in common, how we might find what we have in common in a way that allows us to say we and at the same time to sustain our differences, unquote. Indeed, Gadamer not only does not rest either friendship or solidarity on shared identities, it does not rest either even upon shared values and goals. In examining friendship, he insists that it does not depend upon friends being like one another, nor does it involve the possession of shared convictions, quote, in accordance and inclination and interests, unquote, or, quote, unanimity. Dostal claims that we find solidarity through conversation and dialogue. I would like to argue that for Gadamer, it is not so much that we find solidarity through dialogue and conversation, if by this process we mean that through dialogue and conversation we discover those who think and act as we do. It is rather that the process of dialogue and conversation over social and political matters just is solidarity, the basis upon which we can slowly work to develop common insights and convictions. Let me explain. As Dostal notes, one of the central concerns in Gadamer's writing on politics is the role of technological expertise insofar as a reliance on an expert's knowledge conflicts with practical reflection on what we ought to do. Technical knowledge is important, but it becomes problematic when it substitutes for what Gadamer calls self-responsibility. When we substitute expert knowledge for the obligation to pursue our own practical reasoning, so that, for example, in discussions of biotechnology, we focus on technical issues about the feasibility and health risks of modifying human genes, rather than on the ethical issue of whether we ought to try to do so at all. Ultimately, Gadamer insists we are all responsible for reflecting on the latter issue, on what we ought to do. This kind of reflection cannot be pursued monologically, however. In order to determine what we ought to do, we need to understand both the situation we are in and the norms that are relevant to making decisions about it. Moreover, we need to have the practical knowledge or phronesis that lets us apply these norms. None of these is simply given. Rather, they require interpretation, and interpretation, as Gadamer conceives of it, is a dialogical process. We come to an understanding about something with others, whether those with whom we are in contact, those in the past, or those in our own and other communities. This dialogue is what I think Gadamer sees as solidarity. It is not the agreement we come to as much as it is the basis for undertaking the process, a discovery of our collective responsibility. Dostal raises an important worry about Gadamer's account of solidarity. Although he thinks it is necessary for an adequate politics, he also thinks it is not sufficient. On the one hand, it provides an important corrective to central elements of classical liberalism, including atomistic individualism, the contract theory of the founding of the state, and confidence in the invisible hand of unfettered economic competition. On the other hand, solidarity can as easily ground fascism as it can, quote, a cosmopolitan and democratic socialism, unquote. This is an important worry. Currently in the United States, the dialogues and conversation that Gadamer thinks solidarity involves occur primarily among those who already hold similar views. We inhabit discursive silos where we agree across a range of issues, appeal to the same sources of information, and are almost incapable of communicating with those who do not think as we do. We even live in like-minded communities, both in real life and in our constant presence on online social media. As many social scientists have pointed out, this situation facilitates radicalization. In talking only to those who already agree with us, we reinforce and expand the views that we already hold and take on more forceful and more zealous positions. The result is a society where discourse only among those with whom we antecedently agree may lead, if not to fascism, at least to extremism on both the right and left. To be sure, Gadamer's version of solidarity is meant to escape this outcome insofar as it does not rest on identity or on antecedent agreement on views and goals, but is rather the basic, quote, the basic presupposition under which we can work together to develop it. Yet it remains unclear how we get there from where we are. Dostal relies on Gadamer's defense of phronesis. Dostal recognizes that we cannot, quote, we cannot think or act simply like the ancient Greeks, unquote. As he explains, quote, our cities and nations are larger, our technology is far beyond that of the Greeks, the belief in Greek religion is gone, and so on, unquote. At the same time, he maintains, quote, the appeal to good judgment and the bonds of civic friendship are importantly the same, unquote. They may be, but one of the founding premises of our current situation is that only we, not the other side, possess good judgment, and that civic friendship or solidarity applies only to those who think like us. Thank you.
In her remarks just now, she makes an excellent, succinct statement of Gadamer's view, a view that I support, that solidarity is, quote, non-subjective, non-identitarian, and not necessarily consensual. It involves, quote, explicit recognition of our responsibility to decide practical questions and to do so discursively together, end quote. So solidarity for Gadamer is not made, it's discovered. It's good that Warnke underlines here in her remarks a particular aspect of the discovery of solidarity according to Gadamer. And as she has just said, and I'll repeat it, quote, for Gadamer, it's not so much that we find solidarity through dialogue and conversation. If by this process we mean that we discover those who think and act like we do, it's rather that the process of dialogue and conversation just is solidarity. That's a better formulation than perhaps I put in my book. Warnke is right to ask us to think about the ramifications of Gadamer's view about the fundamental significance of solidarity for our own situation here and now, something that I don't do in my book. Today, as she says, we inhabit discursive silos. We engage primarily with only like-minded people. We watch our channels, they watch theirs. In short, we lack solidarity as a political nation. And she says, worryingly, it remains unclear how we get from where we get there from where we are now. She's surely right about this. Neither Gadamer nor myself have any magic formula to overcome this lack of fundamental solidarity, this being at a loss. Gadamer's basic suggestion is simply to overcome our subjectivism, very broad scale kind of comment, our focus on ourselves, my focus on myself, to really listen to others. A loss of self is central to his account. But even that will fail if the other side will not engage. So here I am about to reenact our current situation by blaming the other. So I won't pursue that. So anyway, conversations may not get very far. We often fail. And it's failure that we're currently facing. In this consideration, we should recognize our current situation has a backdrop of this Anglo-American tradition of strong individualism. And though it may seem hopeless, I'd like to point to one text that I find really interesting and good about this. Robert Putnam's book, The Upswing, points out that solidarity rises and ebbs in American history. And we're at an ebb, but he points out that there have been moments in American history where there was more solidarity, and perhaps we can find a way. Warnke points to the current status of political discourse in the US. This, as we all know, has parallels elsewhere in the world. A somewhat different example is presented by the war in Ukraine. I'm not thinking so much of the two warring sides, but the status of Europe. Gadamer, in a couple of places, points to Europe as a kind of test case for solidarity. Gadamer saw the coming together of Europe and the European Union as an example of finding solidarity with others with whom there are significant differences. He points to different languages, histories, cultural differences among the European countries. And he would remind us that the two world wars of the 20th century tore Europe apart. And he finds hope in the union, such as it is, between and among countries that recently had been at war. He sees Europe as a training ground for humanity. In an interview, Gadamer stated in very strong terms that, quote, if we wish to survive, he means humanity, there must be a conversation dialogue among world religions. They must learn to recognize their partiality and thereby justify their recognition.
All right, well, let's move on then to David Vessey from Grand Valley State University.
I'm going to start with the contrast between Gadamer and Ricoeur, because for Ricoeur, Husserl is a central figure. In his writings, he talks about, is consistently engaging with Husserl's writings. All of Husserl's themes are discussed at some point in Ricoeur, and you just don't find that in Gadamer. I mean, Gadamer talks about Husserl, Gadamer talks about phenomenology, but not nearly with the extent and depth that you find in Ricoeur. And this is a central issue in Dostal's book, is trying to establish Gadamer's relationship to classical phenomenology. In the introduction to the book, he talks about two challenges to Gadamer's hermeneutics. And one challenge comes from within hermeneutics, and it's the question about how we can be sure that our interpretations, this is a quote, provide a basis for establishing correct interpretations and distinguishing good from bad interpretations. So that's within hermeneutics, how do we avoid a kind of relativism? And then the challenge from phenomenology is, how does Gadamer avoid something like a linguistic idealism? How can he assure us that the linguistic character of experienced understanding doesn't imply that our connections to the world are just linguistic in the end? And the second question, by answering that, he attempts to establish Gadamer's relationship to phenomenology. I have a long quote from Ricoeur, where Ricoeur just makes it explicit, and I think it's worth reading because it really lays out the issues. Ricoeur says, even if it's true that every experience has a linguistic dimension, and that this Sprachlichkeit permeates every experience, it's not, however, with the Sprachlichkeit that hermeneutic philosophy must begin. It is first necessary to say what is brought to language. That is why philosophy begins with the experience of art, which is not necessarily linguistic. In the participation of the players in a game, hermeneutics seeks primary experience of belonging to, about which philosophy may inquire. And it is the game which reveals the function of exhibition or presentation, which doubtlessly summons the linguistic medium, but by necessity precedes and supports discourse. And this reference of the whole linguistic order back to the structure of experience constitutes, to my mind, the most important phenomenological presuppositions of hermeneutics. The strategic level proper to phenomenology is then noema, with its manifestations and its modes of belief, its degrees of actuality and potentiality. This constitution of the complete noema precedes the properly linguistic plan, where the functions of denomination, predication, syntactical liaison, and so forth, that's what they have their articulation. The way of subordinating the linguistic plan to the pre-linguistic plan of noemic analysis, that, it seems to me, is exemplary for hermeneutics. That's a long Ricoeur quote where he really sets out the relationship between hermeneutics and phenomenology and how they're interconnected. Now it's up for debate whether Gadamer's hermeneutics provides this phenomenological emphasis on the pre-linguistic, and which, in Ricoeur's words, doubtlessly summons the linguistic medium, but by necessity precedes it. Gadamer simply does not say enough to make his position clear, if he even has a clear position. And philosophers need to look elsewhere to construct a view of what they think fits best with Gadamer's more explicit, articulate views. So Dostal's well aware of this hurdle in Gadamer interpretation. He repeatedly points out Gadamer's lack of clear statements of his positions, and George had read one about political thought. Here's some quotes from Dostal's book. Gadamer never takes up in a significant way the Heidegger concept of the preconceptual. He never attempts to provide an account of knowledge. Perception finds no place in his account. Nowhere in Gadamer's work can be found any kind of extended discussion of perception. In fact, he makes almost no mention of it. He's doing ontology, but there's almost no treatment of what there is or of being, at least in Truth Method. and to the disappointment of many who wish to determine Gadamer's philosophy of language, he has relatively little to say on these matters. Okay, so there's much more Gadamer could have done to articulate his place within the phenomenological tradition. And the two options left for us are to look deep into interviews, letters, other published comments on other people's work. I think Bob, you rely more on the replies in the Library of Living Philosophers volume than anyone else that's done work on this. They'll find these little fragments here and there, or to turn to other philosophers and to reconstruct what Gadamer might think or what he should have said. And his book, Dostal, does more of this than anyone else who's writing an overview of Gadamer's hermeneutics. But doing so doesn't always eliminate contradictions. Drawing upon the essay Boundaries of Language and some interviews and some Heidegger interpretation, Dostal makes the case that Gadamer accepts a pre-linguistic awareness, one primed to be awoken to language. The position Dostal argues we should take as Gadamer's aligns Gadamer with Ricoeur. But still, Dostal argues Gadamer doesn't go far enough. The chapter that will draw the most attention from Gadamer scholars is the 7th chapter, Between Phenomenology and Dialectic, where Dostal argues that Gadamer's attempt to position himself between phenomenology and dialectic fails. It fails because he gives too much to dialectic. He neglects crucial insights from phenomenology about categorical intuition, about pre-linguistic encounters with the world. Dostal, and this is his quote, he's not objecting to the reconciliation of phenomenology and dialectic, nor the togetherness of nous and logos, of intuition and conversation. He is, quote, objecting to a reconciliation by way of identity. Gadamer largely ignores the noetic, but when he considers it, he identifies it with logos. While Gadamer drops heavily from phenomenology in his critique of representationalism, Dostal's right that Gadamer is wary of any non-interpretive, perceptual, or intuitive awareness. Here's a quote from Gadamer, a longer quote. This one's, I don't think it's in your book. For Husserl, perceiving or judging something as something, with regard to meaning or value, was a higher form of mental activity which based itself on the fundamental stratum of the phenomena of sense perception. Insofar as this is the case, the hermeneutical dimension from Husserl comes only later. For him, the concrete presence of objects in perception was in pure perception was first. Now, to be sure, in his careful descriptive work, Husserl himself acted thoroughly hermeneutically, and his efforts were constantly directed toward interpreting the phenomenon in ever-broadening horizons with ever-increasing precision. Yet he did not reflect on the extent to which the very concept of the phenomenon itself is interwoven with the issue of interpretation. This is Gadamer still. That we do since Heidegger. Heidegger showed us Husserl's phenomenological principle contained a hidden dogmatic prejudice. Already Shaler, whose vivacious mind had used the insights both of American pragmatism and of Nietzsche, as well as the results of modern research into sense perception, Shaler showed us there's no pure perception. A pure perception, when fully adequate to the sense stimulus, is an abstraction. That's what Gadamer says. So Dostal's argument is that one can deny pure perception without claiming that all our perceptual and conceptual access to the world is linguistically mediated. Moreover, the view that all perception is linguistically mediated leaves no room for a pre-linguistic perceptual acquaintance with the world that falls into idealism or something like idealism. All knowledge will be discursive knowledge, leaving no room for the kind of categorical or intellectual intuition one finds in Husserl and in Plato, as long as Plato is properly interpreted. Dostal argues that Gadamer drifts too close to this view, even while still acknowledging some form of pre-linguistic awareness. About phenomenology in general, Dostal writes that much of contemporary discussion that is related to the question of the status of perception in its relation to language and concepts finds itself within either or of conceptuality or non-conceptuality. Either the perception is thoroughly conceptual, and he cites McDowell here, or it is non-conceptual sensation, the blind intuition that Kant rejects. The phenomenological tradition, according to Dostal, would avoid this either or. Our perception and concernful dealing with things are often not yet conceptual. yet they are susceptible of conceptualization. And here's my comment at the end here. Instead of trying to avoid the either or, I think Dostal should have seen through his own earlier point, and that is, quote, that Gadamer's view of understanding would seem to fit that of John McDowell in Mind and World, in the claim that perception is already conceptual. So in McDowell's view, the distinctiveness of human perception is that it is an actualization of our conceptual capacities, capacities that are intimately connected to language. One way in which our conceptual capacities are actualized in sensation is through intuitive awareness of the object of sensation, which is only made possible because our conceptual capacities are operative in perception. Such intuitive awareness is only possible because we have the capacity for discursive articulation and explicit conceptualization, even if we don't do that. So McDowell's view, in my view, preserves one thing that Gadamer stresses that Dostal elides. That is the distinction between environment and world, between Umwelt and Welt. McDowell helps us understand the way concepts function in perception without turning into a linguistic idealism. So I think the best explanation of Gadamer's The Inner Word is actually found in McDowell and his phrase of talking about the actualization of conceptual capacities in sensory perception. Gadamer says the inner word enables the connection between forma and verbum. That's just to say with McDowell that, quote, thought and the world must be understood together. The form of thought is already just as such the form of the world. It is a form that is both subjective and objective. That's a quote from McDowell. So if we take this alternative reconstructive approach, it's an alternative to the one Dostal takes, then we would be interpreting Gadamer as neither reducing nous to logos or as identifying them, but as arguing that a kind of intellectual intuition occurs, an intuition that's only possible because we are linguistic beings. Though it's true, this moves Gadamer away from Husserl, from Ricoeur, and flirts with idealism. Yet I still think it's the best reconstruction of Gadamer's views.
Vessey speaks about the challenge of phenomenology, and he's challenging my reading of Gadamer in regard to phenomenology. It might appear to those of you hearing these remarks that Vessey and I are in disagreement about the relation, but I'd like to point out how much we are in agreement about Gadamer in this regard. Our difference has to do with whether we support Gadamer's position as opposed to how we represent his position. Vessey is supporting Gadamer's position, and I am objecting to it. I very much agree with Vessey's assessment that Gadamer does not say enough to make his position clear, that is his position vis-a-vis phenomenology. It's correct to say that I would like to align Gadamer with Ricoeur's view that hermeneutics presupposes phenomenology, and there are some comments in Gadamer seem to suggest that, but for the most part, he doesn't explicitly embrace the view that's provided in that long quote you gave. And there is a second location of this very same objection, and it has to do with Gadamer's appropriation of Plato and Aristotle. Gadamer presents himself as a Platonist. For Gadamer, the difference between Plato and Aristotle is not large, especially for the aspects of their thought that are relevant for Gadamer. Reading Gadamer on Plato and Aristotle presents the following difficulty. It's a difficulty that Sokolowski points out in that Library of Living Philosophers volume. It's difficult to tell whether and how much Gadamer is embracing and endorsing the views that he presents as the views of Plato and Aristotle. I take him to be embracing much, but not all of their thought. He's clear about his differences with Plato and Aristotle, but when he's not objecting, is he agreeing? Among his objections is that they lack a sufficient sense of the historical character of our lives, they do not provide an adequate understanding of freedom, and he finds Aristotle's metaphysics to be too theological. What Gadamer wholeheartedly endorses is Plato showing us that the Socratic way is to follow the logos wherever it might take one. This way is suggested in many of Plato's dialogues, but it's explicitly discussed as the second sailing in the Phaedo. Gadamer presents himself as following the Socratic way of logos, which Gadamer sometimes refers to as the dialectic. This is the way of language. And as we all know, Gadamer commits himself to following the later Heidegger's turn to language. I see a connection in a broad scale sort of way between the important concept of nous in Plato and Aristotle and the concepts of intuition and the preconceptual in Husserlian phenomenology. As Vessey points out, I argue in the book that Gadamer, if he's not simply ignoring nous and the noetic, he's identifying it with logos. His concept of the inner word abets this identification. I won't go on about that. Aristotle says quite clearly in the 6th book of the Nicomachean Ethics that nous is without logos. And one can find this suggested elsewhere in his work. As I'm claiming that Gadamer is not a good Aristotelian in this regard. And of course, my claim presumably wouldn't bother Gadamer, because Gadamer wishes to insist upon the linguisticality of all understanding, and more than that, the linguisticality of all intelligibility. So much the worse for Aristotle. I think this is a failing of Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics, to find a way historically to develop a more adequate notion of the linguisticality of all intelligibility. Gadamer turns away from Plato and Aristotle and turns to Augustine and Aquinas, as Professor Oliva here has just pointed out. But back to Vessey's comments. One way I approached this question in the book was to point to the similarity between Gadamer's position in this regard and that of John McDowell. Vessey cites me in my statement that Gadamer's view of the understanding fits well with the view of McDowell. And Vessey says, and I quote, "I think Dostal should have seen through his own point." The point being the fit with McDowell. I think I have seen through my own point because I'm agreeing with David about the fit between Gadamer and McDowell. That's what I'm pointing out in the book. So David and I agree about the fit. McDowell does have a good articulation of Gadamer's position. I agree. The best construction of Gadamer's views in kind of contemporary American or Anglo-American way. I'm objecting to the fit, and Vessey is endorsing it. Vessey concludes with the statement that Gadamer's McDowell-like view moves him away from Husserl and Ricoeur. I agree. But I think it's a mistake to move away. Not to belabor the point, but let me refer you all to comments by Charles Taylor about McDowell. It's an essay in a collection called Reading McDowell. Taylor argues on behalf of the preconceptual in the mode of, he never mentions Gadamer, of course, in the mode of Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Evans. Taylor claims that there is a dimension in the accounts of human experience by Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, citing Taylor, to which there is nothing corresponding in McDowell's story. In a quote. Inasmuch as McDowell's story and Gadamer's story align with one another, it's missing, on my account, from Gadamer's story. Vessey also says that McDowell's view preserves one thing that Gadamer stresses, but Dostal elides, the distinction between the environment and the world, Welt and Umwelt. I confess I don't understand quite what David means by this and how it's relevant to the issue at hand. I don't see or didn't hear in his comments an explanation of this possibly interesting objection. I'd be eager to hear a little more about what he means by how this distinction of world and environment would be important and helpful. Vessey claims that McDowell helps us understand how concepts function in perception without becoming linguistic idealism, and I do think that's correct. And I argue in the book that it's incorrect to charge Gadamer with linguistic idealism. But I notice in Vessey's last line that he thinks that Gadamer, quote, flirts with idealism. This flirting is why and how some critics have charged Gadamer with idealism. I'm not sure what Vessey's thinking of when he makes this claim. Perhaps it's related to Gadamer's ignoring perception and intuition in the way that both he and I have talked about. But we both agree that Gadamer, in the end, is not a linguistic idealist. I thank Vessey for asking us to think about Gadamer's position with reference to the pre-linguistic and my criticism of it.
In McDowell's Mind and World, that's the one place where he talks at length about Gadamer. He says he got this distinction from Gadamer is very useful. It distinguishes two different ways in which creatures perceptually respond to their environment. Because McDowell wants to say there's a strict difference between animals and babies in the way they perceive the world, and then human adults who have acquired linguistic and conceptual capacities. So animals and babies function in an environment where they're responding to stimulus in various ways, but they're not taking it up in a way where it's potentially conceptual and made intelligible to function within, as he'll say, the space of reasons. So the same way that a baby may respond to an object, it doesn't respond to the object as something that could be spoken about or thought about.
A good number of ways in Gadamer where he refers to something like the speechlessness of visual art. He likes occasionally to talk about music, etc., etc. So very often he seems to be, on my view, operating within a framework which would be very comfortable with talking about the preconceptual and the prelinguistic, which isn't conceptual, it's preconceptual. And he seems to borrow on that and talk about it and write about it in ways that I think Merleau-Ponty and others would be very comfortable with. But when sort of pressed about the point, then he sort of backs off. So, in some sense, I think he sort of wants to have it both ways. And he gets pressed about this in a very late interview. And of course, you can maybe interviews aren't where you're supposed to go to talk about a philosopher. But in any case, Grondin presses him about the prelinguistic. And isn't that which is prior to language in some sense non-linguistic? And Gadamer says, yeah, there's the non-linguistic, but it's still linguisticality. There's non-linguistic linguisticality, he expressly says, which to my mind is nonsense. But it shows the two forces, so to speak, coming together, having to deal with the non-linguistic, the preconceptual, and having to make everything, talk about everything in linguistic terms, and there they sort of really collide. And often he's comfortable in talking about and not too often, but occasionally you find him talking about the prelinguistic in the boundaries of language essay. Mm-hmm. And on my mind, that's a late essay, he clearly is repeatedly criticized for these very reasons. And so then he writes this essay in response, and he talks about the boundaries of language and how there is a prelinguistic. But I don't find an adequate account of it or an adequate adoption of it in his work. So, final comment. I think it's very suggestive and sketchy, but I think Plato and Socrates do give a good model in this regard. And I don't think here Gadamer is the best Platonist. That is, Socrates clearly follows the logos, and there is no simple relying on nous. But it strikes me that for Plato, what the logos is an attempt to articulate that which is noetic. And Gadamer often talks about the inexhaustibility of that which we're trying to express. So that which we're trying to express somehow goes beyond what language can do. And I think Plato gives us an account of that. And the only way we can really respond to that is in language, is logos, and again, following Plato, we are assisted and aided fundamentally and importantly in considering this not only in language, but in conversation with others. Others are going to help show me how to think about what it is that we are just experiencing.
And now Ted George from Texas A&M University.
Robert Dostal's Gadamer's Hermeneutics between phenomenology and dialectic is something of a tour de force. Dostal not only provides a new, trenchant approach to Gadamer's hermeneutics that clarifies the stakes of Gadamer's project and the relevance of his project for broader, current, contemporary philosophy. Dostal also provides a holistic account of Gadamer's thought, clarifying with erudition, precision, and depth each of Gadamer's major themes. Dostal's Gadamer's hermeneutics, then, is therefore both on the leading edge of Gadamer's studies and a definitive statement of Gadamer's thought, and it's going to be an irreplaceable resource for advanced scholars. Dostal's new trenchant approach aims, as his title suggests, to situate Gadamer's hermeneutics as an attempt to reconcile, or perhaps better, hold together in a difficult tension, the central tenets of two divergent inheritances, namely phenomenology especially the classical phenomenology of Husserl, the early Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty, and what Dostal simply refers to as dialectic, as this is represented by Hegel, but especially Plato. For Dostal, the central tenet of phenomenology is that understanding finds a foundation in perception, intuition, or in the term used by Husserl no less than the classical Greek philosophers on whom Husserl draws, noesis. On this view, interpretive experience allows us to determine the meaning of matters under our investigation, not, say, because of conventions that impose specific meanings on particular things. Rather, interpretive experience allows us to determine the meaning of matters under our investigation as the differentiation of meanings that already inhere in things, or, in terms closer to Gadamer, that already belong to things. The central view of dialectic, by contrast, is that understanding is mediated by language, or logos. On this view, our interpretive experience allows us to grasp matters under our investigation not ultimately because of meaning that already belongs to the matters, but rather because of the power of language to determine the meaning of matters through a process of identification through differentiation. Dostal recognizes that by these lights, Gadamer's hermeneutics is typically celebrated as a dialectic. In this, the point de départ is Gadamer's motto, being that can be understood as language. And the position that this motto embodies, namely that understanding, and thus all interpretive experience, is an event that takes place in the medium or element of language. This point de départ also brings into focus the proximity of Gadamer's hermeneutics and the later Heidegger's considerations of language, as these are embodied in his own mottos like language is the house of being, and in focus for Dostal, language speaks. Die Sprache spricht. Dostal does not deny that Gadamer emphasizes the role played in understanding by dialectic, nor does Dostal deny that for Gadamer, understanding is an event that takes place in the element of language. Indeed, Dostal suggests that given Gadamer's own emphasis on the role played in understanding by dialectic, it's perhaps no surprise that some, such as John Caputo, have been led to conclude that Gadamer is a postmodernist, who sees the understanding as a matter of interpretation all the way down, without any reference to facts that we achieve through noesis at all. Dostal maintains, however, that it's a mistake to reduce Gadamer's hermeneutics to a dialectic alone, and thus it is also a misstep to conceive of Gadamer as a postmodernist. Rather, Dostal's approach is that Gadamer wishes to hold his emphasis on dialectic together in a tension with the phenomenological claim that understanding originates with noesis. For Gadamer, as Dostal argues, dialectic and phenomenology are like querulous brothers, recalled from a German folktale. They remain mutually dependent, even in their conflict with one another. Dostal argues that Gadamer, despite his wish to hold these querulous brothers together in their tension, nevertheless ends up favoring dialectic over phenomenology too much. Accordingly, Dostal's project concerns not only Gadamer's wish to hold them together, but also comprises an attempt to make good on Gadamer's wish. On Dostal's approach, then, Gadamer should hold that understanding is an event which begins with perception, intuition, or noesis. That is, a direct access to the reality of the world, things and others. Yet, in turn, Gadamer should hold that the event of understanding unfolds in dialectic, or logos, because the finitude of noesis means that our access to reality remains aspectual, and in principle so. For Dostal, then, understanding requires logos for the determination of the meaning of matters, because our access to these matters through noesis remains always incomplete. The result of Dostal's approach is a hermeneutics that remains true to Gadamer's self-proclaimed concerns for objectivity and orientation toward reality, Sachlichkeit. The result is also a hermeneutics that holds an important position within current debates about the relation of phenomenology and hermeneutics, along with philosophers such as Claude Romano, as well as an important position in debates about so-called new realism, along with philosophers such as Marcus Gabriel, Anton Koch, Günter Figal, and Mirela Oliva. Dostal's new approach to Gadamer informs the comprehensive account Dostal gives to each of the major themes of his hermeneutics. So that's my idea of the main idea of his approach, and then I want to talk about it with reference to one of the major themes that he treats in Gadamer. Case in point is Dostal's treatment of what Dostal himself suggests is the center of gravity in Gadamer's thought, namely his rehabilitation of humanism. Dostal characterizes Gadamer's humanism as a civic humanism. By this, Dostal means that Gadamer forwards his humanism as a socially achieved elevation of ourselves into a universal perspective through conversation. For Dostal, Gadamer's civic humanism thus comprises a direct counterpoint to subjectivism. That is, roughly, the position that not only epistemology, but also ethics and politics should be grounded in the subject. Dostal recognizes that Gadamer's humanism represents an attempt to hold together yet another difficult tension of inheritances, this time in connection with Gadamer's inheritance of Heidegger's thought. On the one hand, Gadamer's humanism is an attempt to further to advance Heidegger's own rejection of subjectivism. As Dostal argues, Heidegger's disavowal of humanism follows from Heidegger's aversion to metaphysics, but at the center of his criticism of humanism is that humanism is a subjectivism. On the other hand, however, Gadamer's humanism represents a divergence from Heidegger's judgment, his verdict, that the forms of humanism we have inherited from the Western tradition are, one and all, themselves based in subjectivism. In this, Gadamer disagrees with Heidegger's assessment that the forms of humanism passed down through the Western tradition involve a Latinization that distorts classical Greek ideas. Instead, Gadamer believes these forms of humanism actually safeguard the integrity of ancient Greek ideas amidst the development of medieval and modern thought. I won't go into it, but I do want to point out that this is one of those examples in Dostal's book of a kind of depth of erudition and precision. He has such a great understanding of the nuanced tension between Heidegger and Gadamer, what Gadamer is trying to do by rehabilitating humanism vis-a-vis Heidegger's critique. And it's perfect. In his book, Dostal examines Gadamer's idea of humanism as an elevation of ourselves into our humanity through Bildung, education, or more specifically, the formation or cultivation of common sense, judgment, and taste. Accordingly, Dostal argues, Bildung is the central concept in Gadamer's humanism, and it carries with it those other three aspects of humanism, and also brings with it the rehabilitation of tradition, authority, rhetoric, and phonetic judgment. Dostal, moreover, argues that while Bildung does not itself embody one politics or another, such an education comprises the ethical basis for us to engage in politics at all. One of the striking features of Dostal's account is his attempt to clarify the position of Bildung in society through a comparative analysis of Gadamer's and Heidegger's rectoral addresses. As Dostal points out, both Gadamer and Heidegger agreed to become rectors at moments of dramatic political transformation. Gadamer, we recall, became rector of the University of Leipzig in 1946 at the moment when the Soviets had begun to assert influence in their zone of occupation. Heidegger, for his part, became rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933, just as the National Socialists had come to power. Dostal shows that despite many differences, including that Gadamer remained doubtful about the Soviets, while Heidegger embraced the Nazis with too much enthusiasm. Both Gadamer and Heidegger focus on the role of the university and with it, Bildung in society. And in this, Gadamer and Heidegger agree on 3 points. First, both argue that the university should administer itself autonomously, independent from any political authority. Though, in Gadamer, this leads to a defense of traditional liberal notions of academic freedom, while Heidegger critiques just such a view. Second, Gadamer and Heidegger also both identify the mission of the university with the pursuit of science, in the German sense Wissenschaft, as this encompasses not only the natural sciences, but also what we would now call the social sciences and humanities. Finally, third, both Gadamer and Heidegger focus on the need for the university to maintain what Dostal calls a scientific ethos. Both believe that this ethos should be comprised of objectivity, Sachlichkeit, and the determination to remain objective in the face of pressures, to remain resolute, in the face of pressures of conformity that jeopardize the independence of the university and the mission of science. Yet telling is a point of contrast between Gadamer's and Heidegger's views of the scientific ethos. Gadamer believes that the scientific ethos should also be comprised of humility, whereas Heidegger, by contrast, believes that the scientific ethos should be combative. While Dostal's treatment of Gadamer's humanism as a counterpoint to subjectivism does much to clarify the stakes of Gadamer's approach, Dostal might have done more to focus on other crucial aspects of Gadamer's approach. For example, Gadamer's humanism is not only a counterpoint to subjectivism. By this same token, it is also a counterpoint to any essentialism about the human subject. There are several reasons it's important to remember that Gadamer's humanism is also a rejection of essentialism. First, the fact that Gadamer's humanism is a rejection of essentialism is an important reminder that Gadamer's project is, in part, to develop a humanism that remains true to Heidegger's view that for us human beings, our essence is nothing else than to exist. Second, it's an important reminder that helps to situate Gadamer's humanism among other attempts made by philosophers such as Levinas, Sartre, and Arendt to revise or revive motifs of humanism while remaining true to Heidegger's approach to human existence, too, in different ways. Third, the fact that Gadamer's humanism is a rejection of essentialism may even open the door to possibilities for humanism beyond post-colonial critiques of the contributions made by essentialist theories of humanism in colonial projects to subjugate non-Europeans around the globe. Finally, the fact that Gadamer's humanism is a rejection of essentialism may also lead us to ask, what, after all, do we elevate ourselves into when we elevate ourselves into a more universal perspective? Patently, Gadamer does not believe that what we elevate ourselves into is a perspective oriented by our essence as human subjects. But what precisely do we then elevate ourselves into? Initially, it seems that what we elevate ourselves into is a more encompassing interpretive perspective, one that incorporates the plurality of perspectives we encounter in our hermeneutical encounters with texts and others. We are led to a more encompassing interpretive perspective thanks to the different interpretive perspectives we find in the texts we read and the others we converse with. This, as far as it goes, is quite correct. Yet Dostal's account of Gadamer's hermeneutics reminds us that what really makes possible the plurality of perspectives we encounter in hermeneutical experience is nothing else than the abstruse character of the matters themselves, die Sachen selbst. As Dostal points out, in hermeneutical conversation, our different perspectives are perspectives about something, a Sache, that we are each able to perceive or intuit, that we experience in noesis, but which exceeds any of our efforts to interpret. Dostal certainly recognizes this, but I would submit that the point deserves more emphasis than Dostal gives it. On Dostal's approach to Gadamer's hermeneutics, humanism is an elevation into a more encompassing interpretive perspective, not simply because it incorporates a plurality of perspectives. More originally, humanism is an elevation into a more encompassing interpretive perspective on the world we already share. That is, a more encompassing interpretive perspective on the matters themselves. This elevation is both possible and pressing because the matters themselves, while always accessible to us, are always only incompletely available, so that our understanding of them remains an infinite task. Thanks.
So thank you for your very generous remarks. In your remarks, you capture much of what I think is important about my book. My book, as the subtitle indicates, follows Gadamer in situating his philosophical hermeneutics between phenomenology and dialectic. I'm gratified to hear you say that, quote, the result of Dostal's approach is a hermeneutics that remains true to Gadamer's self-proclaimed concerns for objectivity and orientation toward reality. As a great reader and commentator on Gadamer, George parenthetically here lets us know that objectivity is Sachlichkeit, not Objektivität. Objektivität is a very important distinction. Objektivität has to do with a narrow sense of objectivity in especially the natural sciences, and Sachlichkeit has to do with the way die Sache selbst, the matters at hand, present themselves to us. As we have just heard, George qualifies his praise for my book. So let me address these two qualifications. I would suggest, and I think his comments suggest the same thing, the two criticisms, such as they are largely rhetorical. By this I mean, he states that he's substantively in agreement with my presentation of Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics, but, and of course there must be a but, that I should have done more with regard to two closely related topics. With regard to Gadamer's humanism, George says politely that I might have done more to focus on an aspect of it, an aspect that I'll comment on in a moment. With regard to the role of the concept of the Sache selbst, George says that the point which I make in this regard deserves more emphasis. Now, both points rest on the judgment, really, of the readership. What does the reader need to know? How might this best be presented? And my book may not have done as well by this as it should have, and George may be quite right about both of these. As I just said, I don't think we disagree substantively about either of these. But there may be some difference between us, particularly with regard to the first of these. So let's look a little more closely. George says, quote, Dostal might have done more to focus on other crucial aspects of Gadamer's approach, for example, as humanism. He says, is a counterpoint to any essentialism about the human subject. Gadamer's humanism is also a rejection of essentialism, end of quote. Earlier in his remarks, George says Dostal means that Gadamer forwards his humanism as a socially achieved elevation of ourselves into a universal perspective through conversation. Here I'm making just a small remark. I'm sure we're in agreement about this, but I just want to underline it. About this remark, I just want to say that Gadamer is embracing the Hegelian concept of Bildung here, rising to the universal. And as George points out, for Gadamer, this is primarily done through conversation. Conversation is done primarily through listening. Yet at the same time that Gadamer embraces Hegel, he's also embracing what Hegel calls the bad infinite. This rising to the universal is an ongoing, indefinitely open process without end. The ascent to the universal, the ascent to the universal is not easy, it doesn't eliminate difference, and it's important to see that is socially achieved. More important to his comment about this is George's suggestion that Gadamer's humanism is a rejection of essentialism. George's remark begins with mentioning the rejection of the essentialism about what it means to be human, though he makes the simple claim Gadamer rejects essentialism. I'm always at a little bit of a loss as to what to say about essentialism. I'm not sure if in the end George and I disagree about the matter. On the one hand, essentialism can be taken to mean ahistorical. And of course, Gadamer insists on the historical character of human experience. In this sense, he's not an essentialist. Essentialism can also importantly be connected to sameness. George is most concerned about an essentialism with regard to the human subject. Essentialism here might mean that we're all somehow simply the same. This too, Gadamer would reject. In coming to terms with the other, we are confronting difference. So here too, in this regard, Gadamer is not an essentialist. But, here's my but. We can often find Gadamer utilizing the concept of essence in a positive way. In Truth and Method, Gadamer asserts that the mimetic picture provides us, and I'm quoting, with knowledge of the essence. Elsewhere, he writes about the permanent essence as revealed in poetry. Sometimes Gadamer seems to be self-conscious about the problematic status of the concept of essence, and he uses the straightforward, rudimentary German term, not a common German term, but Wasgehalt, the what content. Concerning ourselves with the what content is to concern ourselves with what something is. And of course, you can connect this with Plato and Socrates. What is the typical Socratic question? What is? I would suggest that this Wasgehalt notion that Gadamer uses is another way to talk about what at other times Gadamer simply refers to as essence. I think a little discussion by Gadamer in a little paper concerning aesthetics is importantly revealing in this regard. In the essay, Philosophy and Poetry, Gadamer writes, and I'm quoting Gadamer, I should like to point out that Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, developed for philosophy a method of self-understanding. He called this the eidetic reduction, by which all experience of contingent reality is bracketed by a point of method. This is something that happens de facto in all true philosophizing. For it is only the a priori essential structures of all reality that have always and without exception formed the realm of the concept or the realm of ideas, as Plato called it. Now, I take Gadamer in that quotation, the first half he's simply pointing to Husserl's eidetic reduction. And when Gadamer says in that quotation that it happens de facto in all true philosophizing, what he's saying is we don't really need Husserl's method. And that what all philosophy has done is try to achieve the essence, the concept, or the idea. So he is, I would suggest, Gadamer is saying that philosophy is coming to terms with, quote, the essential structures of all reality. Gadamer is comfortable talking about philosophy as coming to terms with the essence of things. Now, one might want to argue this is some kind of uncharistic comment of Gadamer's. It's a kind of slip that he somehow knew better. But I'm suggesting it's indicative of his position. What I would call Gadamer's essentialism is closely tied to something that George is keen on endorsing, a kind of realism. So the second point that George suggests needs more discussion than my book provides is the central role of the concept of the Sache selbst, the Sachlichkeit that philosophy should embrace. This notion is basic to my book and its presentation and critique of Gadamer's hermeneutics, but perhaps, as George suggests, I insufficiently highlighted it. In the book's discussion of dialogue and conversation, I state that what makes agreement possible in a conversation is the concern for truth. The concern for truth is the concern for truth about something. The conversation is inevitably about something. Ultimately, we inhabit a common world. And yes, this common world has many aspects, is mediated in multiple ways, and layers in multiple ways. But in the end, we inhabit the same world. This placing the Sache as what ties us together with the other in our common world is an indicator of what we might call Gadamer's realism. My book, as George recognizes, presents Gadamer as a kind of realist. My question to George is how he connects his own anti-essentialism with his embrace of realism. I'm suggesting that Gadamer's realism is his essentialism. As Gadamer sometimes says, echoing Heidegger, the things show themselves to us to be what they are. Of course, Gadamer sometimes suggests that this showing is a kind of speaking. The things tell us what they are. Professor Oliva earlier said this is sort of metaphorical. I endorse the phenomenological notion that the things show themselves to us, but I resist the notion that they talk to us. Though some things do talk, and that's important. But in accordance with Gadamer and Socrates, I endorse the notion that we best come to terms with the things of our world in conversation with others about what those things are. Thank you.
Two things. First of all, I do think that substantively we really agree about a lot of things. And then I think what you've said about my use of the term or idea of essentialism is right. I probably wasn't careful enough about it and didn't parse out the different ways of thinking about essentialism as you do in your response. And I think you're right. So, okay. Then the question you posed to me is how would I square my view that his humanism is anti-essentialist with my strong endorsement of the realist way that you think about Gadamer? Yeah, I think what I would have to do is be much more careful and have a much more narrow way of thinking about what I mean by essentialism in this context. And honestly, to hear you talk about it, what I might be thinking about something in the history of ideas more than I'm thinking about a philosophical concept. I think that at the moment when Heidegger wrote the letter on humanism, he was responding to the way that Sartre used the idea, the notion of essentialism. And I think that it's an important part of Gadamer's project that in following, the overall trajectory of Heidegger's discovery of the hermeneutics of facticity, that he's rejecting that specific way of thinking about essentialism. I guess, the anti-existentialist essentialism or something like that. I have to sort through it. So, yeah. And maybe maybe the reason for thinking about why it would be important to emphasize this has more to do with the history of ideas than something philosophical. There is a whole milieu of thought in the mid-20th century where people pit existentialism and essentialism against one another. And one of the fascinating things about that moment is that many of Heidegger's followers accept almost everything about Heidegger's thought except his rejection of humanism. And to try and think that through, I think this concept, the way that the notion of essentialism was used historically at that moment will be important to understand.
In reply to your second part of the response on the Letztbegründung, the rejection of foundation. So yes, definitely Gadamer clearly rejects the idea of a foundation. 15 years ago, when I wrote my dissertation on the inner world in Gadamer, I accepted his rejection of foundation, of the foundational thinking. And I thought that he offers a plausible validity in what I called analogical thinking, because he was concerned with the connections between things themselves, the connections between things and the subject, and finally, the analogy between the human mind and the divine mind in the inner world. And Dostal's book is talking about these connections, especially in the section on the language of things. And the analogical model also, I think, offers a new version of essentialism in the sense that the essences of things are included in a larger picture, namely in a sort of totality in which we are embedded practically, so to speak. So I thought that analogical thinking is saving essentialism by giving it a historical and practical twist. All right, now, 15 years after, or more than 15 years after, I am a bit concerned about Gadamer's rejection of foundation. I still think that his analogical model is very compelling, and I found a similarity between his model and the American philosopher Robert Nozick, who is talking about analogical understanding as well. Now, that said, I have two concerns that start also from the discussion on the theoretical and practical life in my comments. So first of all, if we want to take the good as the basis or the support of this connection or balance between the theoretical and practical life, my question would be, isn't the good a foundational principle? I mean, it surely was for Plato, right? I mean, the good is the supreme idea, the chief idea. It is the principle of reality, the principle of human morality, and the principle of knowledge. So if we take the good as the support of theoretical and practical life, that still, to me, stands as a sort of foundational principle. So it seems to me that we cannot do away with foundational thinking if we try to, put together theoretical and practical life. And I have. So.
We are at time, and there are people at the door.
Oh, okay, all right then.
So we're going to have to leave those questions in the air, and thank you for raising them. Thanks to all.